Good morning, sisters and brothers. I am in full DJ mode this morning. Just want to do a quick overview of what we were learning together on Sunday. And so this isn't able to come anywhere near the the kind of robust learning and dialogue that takes place on the Sunday, but it helps us stay on track. So we've been going through the book of Matthew, and we'll continue to do so probably for quite some time. But we hit the pause button here for about 6 weeks for us to talk through who we are as a church, as Praxis. Um, so this generated out of a conversation some of us had, along with others that were part of a launch team, a core team, about the kind of church we want to be, specifically the kind of people we want to be, right? There's certainly programmatic things we do. We gather, we meet in groups, we meet in gatherings, but we're not primarily a program. We're a people. Our values represent the kind of people we want to be. And so we sat on that night and we just wrote on a whiteboard, a white sheet of paper, and filled it up, just saying we want to be the kind of people who, and then we filled in the blank. And that was really the generator for what now we would consider our values, the kind of people we want to be. It's also the night that I left knowing I really want to be a part of something like this, right? And so we're just going to take 6 weeks and talk through 6 values and learn from Scripture where these values are alive and well in the life of Jesus, in the life of His church, and can be alive in our lives. And so first out of the box is that we want to be a people who can talk about anything. So here's a couple of verses. Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. That's tohu va bohu, right? Formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, God's very first action in Scripture is what? He speaks. He gives words, right? He gives a language to things. And He says, let there be light, and there was light. God creates out of tohu va bohu. As much and as creative as we are as human beings, we have to work with the raw materials we have. God, however, can create out of nothing, and He does it with a word, right? He does it by speaking. Now, John 1:1. This is one of the biographies of Jesus, and it begins in the beginning. Same lines. Significant drawback, saying, look back to Genesis 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Now this word, there's this metaphor of a word, but it's a person. It's a he, right? He was with God in the beginning. All the way back there in Genesis 1, when all things were created. Through Him, all things were made. Nothing, or without Him, nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Here's a metaphor for Jesus. He is the Word, right? And words reveal something, right? They describe reality. They're revelatory. They, when you name something as something, it helps shed light on what that thing is. But really, there's only one thing I want to point out here, and that is words have power, right? John begins his story of the biography of Jesus, and he says, no, he's a word, right? In the way that God spoke words in the very beginning, and from them things were created, Jesus shows up as the Word, and He's recreating everything, right? New creation, resurrection, renewal, restoration. All of this to say, just one simple observation. Words have power. It's simple, and it's practical. We know that this is the case. We've experienced it, right? We've experienced the power of words, sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways. I remember a day after having not studied, I had a decent memory. And so for the kind of test that I could just memorize stuff and throw it back out on a page, I could do pretty well. And I remember a day sitting in class and getting a test back and having not studied and seeing a B plus, and I leaned over to my roommate next to me who had studied hard and gotten a C. And the words that came out of my mouth were, "Hey, if I'd studied just a little bit, I would have had an A." Right? Words have power, right? Whether positive or negative. So our question is, how did Jesus use the power of his words, right? We want to be like Jesus. We want to love like he loves. That means we want to talk like he talked. And we've just finished one long extended sermon that he taught, but so much more of what we have of him speaking are stories he tells, or him in conversation, him asking questions or answering questions. He gets questioned about heated debates, like divorce in their days was a huge debate that we'll see later in Matthew. Um, he's questioned by religious elites who are open to him, like Nicodemus in John 3. He's questioned by elites who are opposed to him, like Simon. He's questioned by religious outsiders. Samaritan woman comes to mind. And he's having these conversations over meals all the time. He ate with people in low places, as well as high places, but in low places, what they would call sinners and tax collectors in those days, low life. And in those days, sharing a meal with somebody was much more than just, hey, you had a meal with them. It was validating them in a way. Religious Jewish people had a lot of rules about being clean, and so they wouldn't eat with unclean people, and yet Jesus did. And he conversed, he talked over those meals. So here's just one brief conversation that he has with a man. Comes in a little bit of context. So he and Peter, James, and John have been up on a mountain and experienced this sort of mystical thing where Jesus and God are communing with some ancient Jewish people, and so leaders. And so there's this thing called the Transfiguration. This is mountaintop experience, and when they come down, this is Mark 9, starting in verse 14. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. And as soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing about? What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. So all this energy. And so a man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes at his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your trainees, your disciples, to drive out the spirit, but they could not." So just to acknowledge this, we're not really asking the question about possession here in this passage, but just to recognize it's easy to read this sometimes and think, well, that's such a disease, it's epilepsy. Or we may read it and see, no, that's definitely demonic spirit. The Jewish people would have not necessarily seen those two things as two different things. He would have seen them as both and. And for a lot of us today, we may lean too far to one side and see the devil everywhere, right? Everything that happens is the devil's fault. Or we may lean too far to the other way and see all things as natural, rational, not supernatural, right? But there's something very real taking place here. And this boy is experiencing a terrible, terrible thing. And his father's concerned for him. Verse 19, "You unbelieving generation, untrusting generation," Jesus replied, "how long will I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." Now he's frustrated. Right? This is probably bent towards his trainees, right? Because he's on the path to the cross at this point in Mark. It's insight. He knows his time is short, and he wants them to get it. Verse 20. "So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground, rolled around, foaming at the mouth." Just know how often things get worse before they get better, right? Even when you're on a path towards healing. Verse 21, Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" Now, I think this is really interesting. Like, he doesn't have to ask this question, right? It's not necessary. But he's attentive. He cares. He wants to know the story, right? "From childhood," the man answered. It's often thrown him into fire or water to kill him, but if you can do anything, just take pity on us and help us. It says, if you can do anything, right? And Jesus points that out. He says in verse 23, "If you can." Then he says, "Everything's possible for the one who believes. Everything's possible for the one who trusts me." And immediately the boy exclaims, here's his line. It sounds like a prayer. In fact, I pray it fairly often. He says, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Trust you. Help me to trust you." Verse 25, when Jesus saw that that a crowd was running to the scene. He rebuked the impure spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, literally, you stupid spirit, he says, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet. The little line about lifting him to his feet, the same language as resurrection. Mark's writing this from the other side of resurrection. He's kind of cluing towards it. Lifted him to his feet and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, why couldn't we drive it out? Right? So this is the trainee conversation. Look, teach us how to do this. And he replied, this kind can only come out by prayer. Now, what he's not saying is it comes out by the specific kind of prayer, incantations, or some kind of elaborate wording. In fact, that was common in those days. There were copies, instructions written down, right, about those kind of things, saying the right things, and you can free it. It's just more about, this kind comes out when you're living a life, right, a conversational life with God, when you are connected to God and attuned to Him. All right. So if imagine being this man, your kid is sick, you wish you had, I don't know, I've had kids. My oldest was always one cold away from looking like a prisoner of war. Right? When he got sick, he got so sick. And there were moments where I thought, I just wish I was sick and not him. Right? Here's this father with this concern. And he brings the boy to Jesus. His trainees can't help. He's desperate and he's scared. And then he has this encounter with Jesus. Notice one thing that Jesus does is he takes him apart a little bit, or at least ask him directly, hey, tell me your story. I'm going to know you, right? This isn't some sort of distant healing thing, or Jesus isn't the kind of doctor that doesn't dip in to see you or really want to hear what you have to say, right? He's attentive to the man and the story. He gets to know them. He empathizes. And then he's safe enough for this man to be honest. I don't know about you, but if I wanted Jesus to heal my kid, somebody that could heal my kid, I'd be willing to say anything, right? So when he asks, do you trust me? I would say, I trust you. Which the man does say that, but then he goes on to say, help me to trust you. Like he's honest about his own doubts, about whether or not it's possible or not, or whether or not Jesus can really do it. Jesus was safe to talk to, right? And unfortunately, we haven't always been the same way. The church hasn't always been the same way, right? We're often really good at telling stories of struggle after the fact, right? I used to do all these terrible things. Let me tell you about those things, but we're not safe enough to be able to talk about the struggles that we're actually having in the moment, right? Some topics the church has tended to avoid over the years. Mental illness, all sorts of things there, right? And it can leave us in a space where we're being afraid to ask questions, or if we've asked questions, the response has just been, hey, just have faith, right? Lots of reasons the church has struggled. Not so with us, right? So here's the official wording, as official as it gets, right? That as for us as a people, we are people who can talk about anything. We'll have honest, thoughtful conversations about all areas of life. We'll be theologically honest. That means that we'll speak with confidence while acknowledging the limits of our understanding. Right? That means when we don't know, we'll say we don't know. When there's more than one good, solid, valid way of reading the Bible, then we'll acknowledge there's more than one way to do it. Right? Last sentence. We will be faithful to the essentials while being graceful in opinion and weaving love into every word. So this is why when we meet up in our groups, everybody gets to speak. Everybody gets to be heard and valued, no matter who you are, right? No matter your behavior, no matter your beliefs, no matter whatever, you get to speak. It's also in our gathering every week that we do what we call dialogical preaching. That's just what we call Q&R, right? Question and response. It's not question and answer, specifically because I'm not always sure we can give an answer, but we can always give a response, right? But all of those are hopefully ways for us to be safe to show up and safe to speak up. Right? And we recognize this doesn't look like our current culture very much, where we're often not safe to talk about things, where instead of empathy, trying to seek the other's perspective, we're just talking at each other, forcing our own perspectives onto each other. Deborah Tannen wrote a book that she titled The Argument Culture, right? Describing today's American culture. And I think she's right, right? So some of the things we talked about how we can talk the way Jesus talked, was to seek to understand another's perspective, to do what Jesus did. Hey, tell me your story, right? How long has he been this way? So ask the questions. Why do you think that way? Why do you behave that way? What would it feel like to be you? If I was experiencing what you were experiencing, what kind of feelings, emotions might I be experiencing? Right? So we seek to understand perspective. We suspend judgment. Right? Doesn't mean we don't maybe judge and ask the question whether it's right or wrong in the future, but we just start with, okay, that's different. We hit the pause button on the judgment. And we're clear about the goal of the conversation. We have the right goal. And that goal isn't to be right, it is to be loving and to bless. Right? It's this thing called agenda anxiety related to having something we really want to talk about. And so when we finally get an opportunity where there's just a moment when something close to the topic comes up in conversation, we just do this huge brain dump, right? Here are my list of 10 things that I want to make sure I get across. But our goal is just to be more loving than to be right. And we talked about listening. So there's this great little proverb that says, it's Proverbs 18:13. To answer before listening, that is folly and shame. Shame, right? So this is our goal, is to be the kind of people who can talk about anything. So look forward to seeing you next week. Grace and peace, everybody.